Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 65 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. In this video and in our upcoming video, we will discuss everything you need to know to effectively use ASP.NET Core Identity to implement security related features in your ASP.NET Core application. What is ASP.NET Core Identity? Well, it is a built-in membership system. It allows us to create, delete, update, and delete user accounts, account confirmations, authentications, and authorization, password recovery, two-factor authentication, with SMS. It also supports external logging providers like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, etc., and much more. We will discuss implementing these features in our upcoming video in this series. Now let's add support for ASP.NET Core Identity in our ASP.NET Core application. The first step is to make our application DbContext class inherit from IdentityDbContext. So let's put here identity. The first step is to make our application DbContext class inherit from IdentityDbContext instead of DbContext. Let's bring in the required namespace by pressing Control Public. Control Public. So we need to install this package. Install with package manager. Go to, or you can find and latest version. No, we don't want the latest version. Okay. Why I am going to tell you. So you go to tools, and from here you need to do what? You need to add the browser tab. You need to search for Microsoft.ASP NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. So here it is. So install it. We want not the latest stable version. We need our project version. That is what? That is 8.0.0. Okay, where it is? Here it is, and install it. Okay, apply this. So we have successfully installed this version 8.0.0 installed. Now close it. Okay, now what we need to do, we need to bring in the required namespace by pressing Control Public. We already installed that. Notice this class is present in using Microsoft.ASP NET Core Identity Entity Framework course. So let's click this. If you are wondering why do we need to inherit from IdentityDbContext class, well, that is because this class IdentityDbContext provides all the DB set properties needed to manage the identity tables in the underlying data in the underlying data store. In our case, Microsoft SQL Server database, we will see all the tables that the ASP.NET Core Identity framework generates in just a bit. For now, let's go to the definition of this identity DB context. Go to the definition of this identity DB context. Notice it inherits from identity DB context. Identity DB context of identity user and identity role. If you go to definition of this class, it inherits from another variation. It inherits from another variation of identity DB context class. As we go through the inheritance change, we will see as we go through the inheritance change, we will see what we will see. Ultimately, identity DB context class inherit from DB context. So here you need to press Control Public. Now right mouse button, click at it, go to definition. Okay. If you go through the inheritance chains, we will see ultimately identity DB context class inherits from DB context. Inherits from DB context class. Identity DB context class inherits from DB context class. Okay. As you can see here, you scroll up, so here it is. Ultimately, identity DbContext class inherits from DbContext class. There we go, this variation of identity. There we go, this variation of identity user context. This variation of identity user context class inherits from the DB context. Okay, this variation of identity user context inherits from the DB context class. Okay, this variation, I am talking about this identity user context. This variation of identity user context class inherits from this DB context class. This is the reason. Reason if our application DB context class is inheriting from, if our application DB context class is inheriting from identity DB context class, we don't have to explicitly again inherit from the DB context class. So this is our first steps. So this is our first step. Make your application DB context class derived from the identity DB context class. Okay, what is the first step? The first step is to make your application DB context class inherits from or derive from the identity DB context class. Next, what next? We need to add ASP.NET Core Identity. So go back to the Visual Studio and go to the program.cs file, because we are using minimal hosting model. So what is our next step? We need to add ASP.NET Core Identity service to our application, like many things in ASP.NET Core. We do this in the program.cs file under this register DB context section. The minimal hosting model of .NET 8. To add identity service on this add service to the container, to add identity service on this add service to the container, we call the aptly name add identity method. Add identity, as you can see here, add identity method, aptly name add identity method. Notice from the IntelliSense, this method has got two generic parameters, TUser and TRole, where TUser is a class, and TRole is also a class. So for the first parameter, I'm going to pass the built-in IdentityUser class as the argument, and for the second parameter, I'm going to pass the IdentityRole. As the first argument. So I'm going to pass the built-in IdentityUser class as the argument, and for the second parameter, I'm going to pass IdentityRole. IdentityRole class as an argument. If you see any red squiggly below these two parameters, below these two parameters, then bring in the required namespace for these two classes, which is Microsoft.NET Core .Identity. If you are wondering why we are using this identity user class, well, to understand that, first let's go to the definition of this class. So first let's go to the definition of this class. It inherits from identity user of string. It inherits from identity user of string. So let's go to the definition of this class as well. So let's go to the definition of this class as well. Notice we have properties like, email, password, hash. Scroll down a little bit. We have properties like email, password, hash. Where is the password hash? Here it is, password hash. Username is little bit up. There is the username, etc. ASP.NET Core Identity uses this inbuilt identity user class to manage the details of the registered user of our application for every property. For every property that you see in this class. That you see in this class. We have a corresponding columns in the underlying user table. We will look at that in action in just a bit. But if you take a look at this class has got only a limited set of properties. What if you want to store additional informations like the gender of the user and their city? We don't have properties for gender. We don't have the property of. Do you see the property of gender? What if you want to store additional information like the gender of the user and their city? We don't have the properties of for gender and city within the within this built-in identity user class. Within this identity user class, we don't have any properties for gender and city within this built-in identity user class. So what we can do? Is create a custom class and make that custom class inherit from this built-in identity user class, and then within that custom class we will include properties for all the additional data we want to capture, and then plug that custom class in class in instead of built-in identity user class. We will discuss how to do this in our upcoming videos in this series. Similarly, identity role is also a built-in class provided by ASP.NET Core Identity System, and as the name implies, it is used to manage user role information. We will discuss adding new roles and implementing role-based authorization in our upcoming videos. Now we want to use entity framework code to retrieve user and role information from the underlying SQL Server database. Using entity framework code, we configure that by calling add framework stores method. Add framework store method. Okay, what we are going to do now, we want to use entity framework core to retrieve user and role information from the underlying SQL Server database. Using entity framework core, we configure that by calling add entity framework stores method. So what we need to do here, pass the generic arguments. So what is the generic argument? That is ASP-DB-Context. We can take it from here also. This is the generic argument. And go to program.cs file and paste it here. Okay. As a generic argument, we specify our application DB context, which is a app DB context. This is our second step. Why is it is showing red squiggly here? Okay. Go to the notepad and copy and paste it here. Okay, that is the reason if we do not use this, we were getting that red squiggly. Okay, this is our second step. This is our second step to add the service here. Adding this is our second step, adding ASP.NET Core Identity service in program.cs file, the minimal hosting model. What is the next step? So what is the next step? Next step is add the authentication middleware to our application request processing pipeline section of program.cs file. Here it is. In this slide, here it is. We need to add authentications middleware to our application request processing pipeline section of program.cs file, app.useAuthentication. Okay. So go back to the Visual Studio. Here we need to pass that. Application request. Here we need to pass middleware. Add the authentication middleware. This is the authentication middleware. We need to add it to our application request processing pipeline section of program.cs file. So in the configure HTTP request pipeline section, so in this section, so in the configure HTTP request processing pipeline section, to add authentication middleware, call use authentication, call middleware call use authentication method. So in our program.cs file, the minimal hosting model and the configure HTTP request pipeline section, let's call use authentication extension method. We want to be able to authenticate users before the request reaches the map controller route middleware. Guys, let me tell you little bit about this map controller route. This map controller route is itself an endpoint mapping method. So there is no need for a route object or callback. Each route is registered directly. This map controller route is the modern endpoint routing approach used in the minimal hosting model program.cs file from ASP.NET Core 6 onward. It integrates with the shared endpoint routing system and is the recommended pattern for current ASP.NET Core application. Next, we need to create ASP.NET Core identity tables in the underlying SQL Server database. For that, we need to create a new migration. Before that, let's save the changes and build our solution to make sure we don't have any compilation error. So save the changes where you have made. There we have made the changes. So save this. And we have made where it is in the program.cs file. Save the changes. And build the solution. Where is the build? To build solutions, right click, build solution, Control Shift B, so that we don't have any compilation error. There we go, build succeeded. Next, we want to add new migration. Next, we want to add new migration. To add a new migration, we use add migration command. We discussed migration in detail. We discussed migration in detail in our previous videos in this series. So within Visual Studio, in the Package Manager console window, let's use add-migration command. Go back to the Visual Studio, and where we need to do you see the tab here of Package Manager console? So go to the tools and you get package. There is the this one. This is the console. Okay, so within the Visual Studio and the Package Manager console window, let's use add-migration. Add-migration. Add-migration command, and we need to specify the name. Let's call the migration adding identity. adding identity, and then press the enter. Press the enter key, we have an error. We have an error, the entity type identity user logging. Identity user logging of string requires a primary key to be defined. If you are getting this error, the most likely cause is within our application DB context class. So go back to app DB context class. In the application DB context class, we are overriding on model creating method, but you are not calling the base class on model creating method. In this case, the base class is identity. In this case, the base class is IdentityDbContext. To fix this error, all we need to do is call the base class on model creating method. Base class on model creating method using the base keyword. We have used this base keyword, and then to this and then to this pass this incoming model builder object. Keys of identity table are mapped in on modeling keys of identity tables. Keys of identity tables are mapped in on model creating method of this identity DB context class. Of this identity DB context class by calling base dot on model creating. We are calling the on model creating method of this identity DB context class. So the keys are mapped, and we no longer should have this error when we add the migration, and we no longer have this error when we add the migration. So let's try the migration command once again. Before that, we need to save the changes and build our solution one more time. Build the solution. So let's try the migration command once again. So what is the migration command? Add migration, adding identity. So press enter. So migration added. So migration added. Notice the code in this migration. Notice the code in this migration creates several identity. Notice the code in this migration creates several identity tables like ASP NET roles, ASP NET roles. Where is the ASP NET roles? This is the ASP NET roles. ASP NET users, etc. Before we apply this migration to our database, what we need to do? Let's take a look at the table that we have in the EmployeeDB34 database. So let me show you this migration first. Okay. So let's take a look at the table that we have in the EmployeeDB34 database. So go to the SQL Server Object Explorer. Open the database. I think this one. Here it is, our database, EmployeeDB34. Here is our database, EmployeeDB34 database. At the moment, we only have two tables. So let's go to the tables, expand it. So here we see only two tables. DBO employees and DBO entity framework migration history. These are the two tables we have right now before applying the migration to the database. Now let's update our database. Now let's update our database. So go back to the package console manager. So how to update the database with this migration? For that we use update database command. Update dash database, that is the command. Hit enter. Build succeeded. If we take a look at our EmployeeDB34 database now, notice we have several identity tables. So go to the SQL Server Object Explorer and refresh the tables. Notice we have several identity tables. If we take a look at this app net user, Where is the app net user? This one. If we take look at this app ASP net user table, notice the column in this table. Notice the column in this table correspond to the properties that we have in this built-in class. Which one? In this built-in class. Not this one. Yeah, in this built-in class. Notice the column in this. Notice the column in this table. Table correspond to the properties that we have in this built-in class identity user. Where is the identity user class? This is the identity user class. So the column in this table, column in this table correspond to the properties that we have in this built-in class identity user. As you can see, we have the username, normalized username, normalized username, email, normalized email, normalized email, and then email confirmed. And here you can see also you also can see email confirm, and then password hash. Where is the password hash? Is here. So the column in this table, the column in this table correspond to the properties that we have in this built-in class identity user. In this built-in identity user. ASP.NET Core uses this built-in class identity user and entity framework code to manage the data that we have in this ASP NET user table net user table. And this is exactly the reason why we have specified identity user, identity user as the generic argument for add identity method right here, and same is true even for identity role. At the moment in this ASP NET user table, net user table, we do not have columns. We do not have column to store additional information about the users like their gender or city. In our upcoming videos in this series, we will discuss how to extend the how to extend this inbuilt identity user. This inbuilt identity user class. We could store additional. So we could store additional information about our registered users. At this point, at this point, our application is configured to use ASP.NET Core Identity. We also created the required identity tables in the underlying SQL Server database. Our next step is to register new user. We will discuss how to do that using ASP.NET Core Identity in our next video. That's it in this video. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.